Let's start over. All right. So the goal, again, the purpose of the discussion section is to interpret and describe the significance of your findings. And one of the things that it talks about on this resource is that it wants you to reframe it as part of the past literature. So how does this provide additional information in the body of research? So for instance, if you're doing research on self-esteem and you're specifically interested on the impact of social media on self-esteem, well, in your literature review, you would have described what is self-esteem and past research on it, right? That may have talked about how people feel in social interactions and how there could be negative impact that way. I don't know, I'm making stuff up here, but you would have a framework or some basis to go on in the past literature. And now you're taking your results and fitting it in, adding it in to the literature. So in most discussion sections, you need to do that for the purpose of our class, because it was such a small research paper, and again, don't feel bad about that, but we just don't have the time to do a really eloquent, thorough, really involved research project. That is not going to be a requirement. So there's some sections on here that I'm like, you can skip that. We're not going to be doing this. So this would be important to pay attention. But the discussion section is going to start with you saying, discussion, you're going to talk about that, and then interpretation or description of findings. So we'll go into all of this here. This is key. The discussion section is often considered the most important part of your research paper. Now, I would say it's tied with the results section, and my hope is that as you guys look at research articles, that you go straight to the results and then come up with your own interpretation as to what the numbers mean, and then read the discussion, so that you're not just being spoon fed what the researchers thought it meant, but you're also coming up with your own ideas. The reason why the discussion section is most important is that it's where it ties it all together. So this is the result of our study. This is what we think it means. This is how it ties back to our hypotheses. Here's some of the limitations, some areas we could improve on, and here's where we think the body of research should go next. So what is some future research ideas? Okay, so that's the overarching goal. So again, why is it the most important part? Well, it's because it most effectively demonstrates your ability as a researcher to think critically about an issue. Now, remember, we did a whole lecture on the null hypothesis, right? And what if that's all you're able to, you fail to reject the null, in other words? Does that mean you throw away all the data and you're like, well, I'm done doing research ever in my life? Do we do that?
No, you would just try to explain the reasoning for getting the null hypothesis.
Right. And in fact, when you cannot reject the null hypothesis, it requires a lot more critical thinking than when you actually reject it, right? Because you spent an entire literature review kind of building the framework as to why you thought your hypothesis was going to occur, your alternate hypothesis or your research question. So you've already done that. So once you get to the discussion, you're like, woohoo, we were able to reject the null hypothesis. And in fact, it supported our claims based on the literature review. That doesn't show a whole lot of critical thinking. It's when you get unexpected results that you really have to dig deep and think through, what does this mean and why did this happen? And so from that point on, you create some sub-hypothesis. And from those, right, you can then talk about future research. So let's say the social media and self-esteem piece that I was talking about earlier. If you discover that, in fact, your hypothesis was that social media would lead to a decrease in self-esteem, but you find for one of them that maybe Instagram makes people feel better about themselves, right? So you're like, well, that's an unexpected finding. Why is that? And so then you could dig deeper as to what kinds of people are they following on Instagram. So perhaps the increase is because the folks they're following, it doesn't feel quite as comparative, right? Oh, they're doing that. Oh, I didn't get to do that. Then you feel bad about yourself. Maybe it's something else altogether. Again, making stuff up. But there's a group that did social media, right? Or is that in my other section? Did one of you guys do social media?
Yeah, my group did.
Yeah. So yeah, you're probably like, Dr. Woltel. No, those are not the findings, but you get the idea, right? Like as an example. So again, we'll talk about unexpected findings in a minute. So why is the discussion section most important? Because that's where you get to show your critical thinking skills. It shows the underlying meaning of your research and implications in other areas of study. So again, this is where we're going to tie it to future research. It's going to highlight the importance of your study, and it's going to state how the findings of your study revealed and help fill the gaps in the literature. Now, number 4 right there, we're not going to be doing that quite as much because we're not linking it back to past research in quite the same way. And then lastly, we're engaging the readers to think really critically also about the data, what it means, and where do we go next. So this is why it's important to have a good discussion section. Again, in your results section, your goal was not to explain any of the data, right? I was like, just give me numbers, because that's really all you're doing. The discussion section is where you unpack and make sense of all those numbers, and then kind of do the so what? What does it mean, right? Do we reject the hypotheses we previously had? Do we fail to reject? What does that look like? If we fail to reject, why? What happened there? What are some limitations? Again, we'll dive into each of those sections as well. Okay. These are just general rules in terms of what you should do for a discussion section in terms of your writing. So you don't want to be super repetitive or make this a super verbose long section. You want to explain things away, but you want to be succinct. So when you think about structure of your paper, each hypothesis should be a paragraph. And as you're describing the data, try to structure it that way. So the first part you'll start with is your demographic variable, right? So you can start by writing at the top discussion, right? That'll be the heading. Your first subheading can be demographic variable. And in there, you will describe what you found, right? In our study, we had 79% female respondents, 22%, no, that's more than 100, 18% male respondent, and whatever's left over from that 2% non-binary or did not want to respond, right? Now you would write it out. Let me get where's my annotate here? All right, so discussion, right? You're writing this at the top. You go back over here, demographic, okay? That would be like right here on the side. Now, if you talked about numbers, right? So you'd say something like females was 79%. Okay, in parentheses, you can write the number. So N equals, and again, it would be in your table, like, so you're not having to do any additional calculations. N equals, I don't know, I'm 61, okay? I'm making stuff up here. I don't know what your numbers are, but this is how you would write it, okay? Again, this is gonna mirror very much what you see in a published research paper, okay? Does this make sense, what I'm describing here? I just wanna check.
Yeah. And is this is all on Course Connect as well, right? Or is
what do you this article is linked on Course Connect? Yeah,
okay,
actually.
perfect. I just didn't know if I could access it later.
Yes, it's right here. Discussion section must-haves.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. My rambling will be available later on YouTube. Okay, so you want to do that for the demographic variables. And then as you dive into your actual measured variables, you would have a section on that. So you would have survey results, and then you would go through. So for many of you, you had categorical variables. Do you strongly agree or strongly disagree with the statement that you got enough sleep? Making stuff up here again. And then people wrote 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then you likely ended up completing a mean and standard deviation for that. So you would need to write that out. The average number of hours of sleep in our sample of college student was 6.25 hours with a standard deviation of 1.5 hours. According to the research, so you can right there, this is a simple enough one that you can link it back. What did the previous research in your lit review say? Maybe it said something like, well, on average, young adults get 8.5 hours. So maybe there's something about your sample that is below the national average, right? So you'd make a linking statement right there. Okay. Avoid the use of jargon or undefined technical language. I don't think that's going to happen with any of you guys. But for instance, if you had been talking about you know, a number of sleep hours, don't all of a sudden call it number of REM hours, right? Like we're not doing that. We're going to keep the language the same. Follow a logical stream of thought. And so with your specific structure, again, we start big. So demographic, then down to your survey question, then down to your hypothesis. That is the goal. That's the funnel we're going through. You want to make sure you're matching verb tense, right? So if your entire paper talked about, you know, present tense, I am doing this, this is happening, continue in that format so it doesn't get jarring. And then this is key. I love subheadings because it categorizes everything. It looks nice and neat. So make sure you are using subheadings as I just described. So you start with discussion, then go into demographic variables, then you go into survey results, then hypothesis. You want to actually include the word hypothesis so you can state whether you reject the null hypothesis or if you fail to reject the null, and what does that mean? Questions here? Okay, I'm gonna erase this because if I scroll down, then it gets all wonky. Okay. Now, what are you including in terms of content? So first, you're explaining your results, right? We got a mean of 3.5, which means most people answered that they felt neutral about this thing, or most people answered that they, you know, went on social media between 3 and 5 hours a day. You know, whatever it is on your specific measure for your survey, you want to just include that and provide some background. Okay, so you're explaining the results. Obviously, in the demographic variables, you don't need to do quite as much explaining, right? If you're describing female and male, you don't need to go into a female is blah, 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 right? Like we're not doing that. That's pretty self-explanatory. Same with age, right? This is the average age. It's just once you get into your survey results, like give a little context there, right? Don't just say, for the questions in regards to sleep, the mean was 3.4. No one knows what that means, right? So you need to add another sentence that says, it was on a scale of X to X, and this means people on average were here, right? Whatever they clicked as their response. Does that make sense?
I have a quick question.
Yeah, thank you for
for-
asking questions.
For each of like the subsections, what do you like recommend the length to be of the paragraph? Like just a regular paragraph?
I am not good at answering those questions because as long as you're describing the results, I don't really care how long or short it is. You know, for some of you, you had 5, 6 questions of demographic variables. So, I mean, if it takes 2 to 3 sentences to describe each, well, that times the number of demographic variables. Others of you only had 2, right? So that's just going to vary between each of you. And then depending also on what kind of data you ended up getting from your survey and how long your survey was. Yeah, I don't have a good answer for length. Don't be verbose. That was like hint number 1 at the top there. You don't need to be like flowery, like fancy writing. That's not the goal. Again, really the goal is to describe what are the results. And then as I'm going to describe in a second here is you need to then link it to your hypothesis. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so that is the explanation of results. Yeah, I mean, it's described right here again, but you can talk about whether or not the results were expected. So this especially, I think, would be important for, do we have, I don't know if we have this data, but like for some demographic variables, if you end up having a huge split in male to female, or you have a major split on athletes, actually, I think that will apply to some of you. If your study was specifically with student athletes, you're good to go. But if it wasn't, and you mostly got athletes, you need to talk about that, right? Because that is not then representative. And I realize I just switched my screen here. I was going to look to see if they have Aquinas student body statistic. Maybe you guys know that already. There it is. Okay. So I don't know, this is as of when, but has a total of 1758, and this is Aquinas College, yeah, enrolled students. We see there are more females than males, so it's a 40-60 ratio. And then we could see if there's more information here on, that's by gender. Okay, then you see race and ethnicity, age distribution, okay, online distance learning. Well, this is kind of fun. Look at all these stats. So if you want to refer back to this, let me just do that and then put that in the chat so you guys can see it. Okay. You can refer back to this too. So in this section right here, if something is unexpected, right? If you got only guys, well, your sample is not really representative of the population, right? The population of Aquinas has a 60-40 female to male ratio. You can also talk about average age. If the average age of your sample is 23 and we're seeing the average age is really closer to 20, then you need to speak to that, okay? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'm asking that a lot this morning. I just want to make sure you guys are grasping what is expected here. Okay, so that is the explanation of results. Next, you will use some of this, not for a whole lot though. Reference to previous research. If there is something, like I was giving the example of sleep number of hours, if you have something that's that clear in your literature review that says this is the national average for this age group, and then you get your value, you're like, oh, that doesn't really match. Or actually, yes, it's totally spot on. So my sample then is quite representative of what the national average. This way you can link it. But anything else, do not spend a lot of time on that. I think this is really just something a graduate level research class would be focusing on a lot more. So this here, you can kind of avoid for the most part. Okay. Deductions. So this is another key piece. Once you're done describing or explaining the results, you want to have this deduction piece. So that's the part where you're bringing it all together, right? It's a claim for how the results can be applied more generally. So that section is called the implication section. So again, we've got our discussion heading, then we have a subheading of demographic, then survey questions, then you'll have an implication subheading, which is your deduction, right? So what does this mean? How do my results help the general population, right? We're really tapping into external validity here. So, you know, anything that you noticed, this actually can be, you know, we'll talk about this in a second when we talk about limitations, but your implications need to tie back to what were the original hypotheses and what does that mean for people at large? So as an example, if you're again doing social media and self-esteem and you end up discovering that on the whole, engaging in larger number of hours on social media decreases self-esteem, the implication would be we are growing to be a society that has more and more ties to social media. There's new platforms that pop up right and left. And we are seeing a bit like stark reality that the greater you engage in them, the worse you feel about yourself. So something needs to be done systematically as our country or, you know, whatever, as a culture to mitigate the impact of social media on personal self-esteem. Otherwise, we will see rise in mental health symptoms, right? So you're taking the implication of your result and broadening it back. Okay. Questions about that? Because that's usually where people are like, oh, how do I do that?
Is this, wait, never mind.
Answered your own question or?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so that makes sense to everyone? No one has a question about that? Okay. You guys are like, we got this, Dr. Woltell, we're on it. This hypothesis section, that can be kind of linked with your explanation of result as to whether that, whether you were able to confirm your hypothesis, if you failed to reject the null hypothesis, right? So that's linking it back. I would say the hypothesis is tied in as you're explaining your results. Okay. We talked about this already. How do you organize and, put the structure of this discussion? So it's an inverted pyramid. So we start big, demographics, survey, specific hypothesis, and then we'll go into the next sections as well. Okay. Again, we're using the same key terms. We talked about that already. We're going to restate the research problem if that is needed in certain questions. Again, if you're describing the results, you want to describe what the survey question, what that was linking to, so we're providing some context there. Again, you really need to discuss unexpected findings. Anything that was not what you expected or what the literature review was written to support, you want to spend some time on that. And this is your opportunity to come up with what's called like post hoc, hypotheses. So this is unexpected. One of the reasons why we may have seen this is because, and then insert your thought process, right? It may be that there's another element at play. Maybe there was a confounding variable, right? So you will do that kind of in your description of your results. That's going to be included in there because as you're describing your result, if something's unexpected, that's where you're going to fill the gap. Okay. So just as a reiteration, this is the discussion section. That's the main heading. Then you're going to have a subheading for demographic, subheading for survey results, subheading for implication. The next subheading is limitations. Whoops, I clicked on something and I didn't mean to do that and then realized that was a hyperlink. So limitations and weaknesses, but you could just call it limitations. Now, every single study ever performed has limitations, always. Okay, so yours will not be any different. Okay, let's think out loud. What might be some limitations of our studies?
The fact that everything had to be done virtually.
Okay, so virtual presentation and virtual recruitment. Good. Other ideas?
Not like the biggest pool of participants.
Absolutely. For most of you, small sample size is going to be a limitation because even though you did a great job, and that's why I clump you guys in groups so that you can get closer to 60, 80, 100. For most of you, you probably weren't quite at that number. And even then, that's still a small sample size. So yes, small sample size. What might be other limitations?
Having like people fill it out from one specific group, like maybe from like a lot of like people from one grade level, or not having like from a lot of other grade levels or sport or like different sports, something like that.
Yeah, Mara, that's a good point. So what I would say, how we could label that limitation would be non-random recruitment, right? It was not a random sampling that we did. In other words, it's not like you took every single enrolled student and then did a random number generator and figured out, I'm going to ask those people to fill out my survey. It was more of a sampling of convenience, right? I'm going to ask people that I know, people I'm in classes with, people I do sports with, and inherently, because these are people that are similar to me, right? There's going to be similar majors, similar grade levels, similar age. So it becomes a really homogeneous sample rather than a diverse sample. So yeah, so the limitation there is that random sampling was not used. Good. Another limitation? My dog had an idea. Think about your instrument. Any limitation there? Gonna let her in before she barks at the neighbor. Come on. Oh, there's deer in the backyard. That's the issue. All right, what do we think? The instrument. Think about the survey that you gave. And any limitation there?
In regards to like electronic devices, some people don't have an electronic device to access the survey. So some people might have been left out of the like results and everything, so we don't have like a full range of like what is it like representation of all like
Yeah.
students.
Okay. So yeah, I think that kind of ties back to what Sam was saying in terms of it all being remote or virtual, is that then that becomes a requirement, is that somebody has access to email and access to an electronic device to complete the survey. Okay. What about the actual survey instrument? Did you guys pick some that were super validated and you included every single question that was in the instrument when it was originally developed? Because I think for most of you, the answer is no, right?
No, my group did not.
Right. And that's okay, because we talked about it and we're like, well, we are giving this instrument for the purpose of a class, and we are just asking for the benevolence of fellow Aquinas students to complete our survey, right? They are not getting any sort of compensation for this, right? So we cannot, in good conscience, make it 100 questions, right? That was part of our discussion. We cannot make it super long, because that's going to lead to a low response rate and it's too much demand on our participants. So because of that, we found surveys and then handpicked some questions from it, right? Well, there's a problem there. That's a limitation, because who knows if we actually accessed what the construct was that was being measured in the survey by simply selecting certain questions. So that is a limitation. The survey instrument that you guys used was short and likely was not the full survey instrument as developed by the original researchers. So that's something else we need to mention. Okay. Yep.
I think going off another thing I saw in my experiment was some of the answers that people gave were not usable, either because they misread the question and then answered it, or their answers kind of conflicted, so we had to throw it out.
That is a great example. So in your limitation section, you can absolutely dive deep. So you can go instrument issue. Well, we didn't use the full instrument, wasn't fully validated. And some of our questions were worded in a way that caused confusion and was not reflective of, I'm so sorry, my dog found a piece of pumpkin from last fall and now is eating it. This is just, he's living his best life. Let me bring him in, because this is gonna make him sick. Anybody want a golden retriever puppy these days? Because he is being a pain in the tushy. All right, so you can start by talking about how the instrument as a whole, the survey instrument, was shorter, wasn't what it was intended to be, that you handpick question, and specifically, like I was just saying, you know, piggybacking on what Sam was mentioning, that some questions were not read correctly, or the meaning of the question was misinterpreted by participants, and thus questions had to be tossed out. Specifically, and then you would insert the question, right? And you could even state on there, when asked this, participants responded as if this was the meeting. However, this is what we were getting at. So because of that, we had to toss the question. Does that make sense? So you can go real narrow there and speak specifically to a specific question on your survey that had to be tossed out. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. The last piece that I think we all could include as a limitation is the short period of recruitment, right? That was a limitation. We did not have 2 months to recruit participants to join our study. It was very limited to like 2 weeks. So because of that, that impacted our total survey numbers, the number of participants in our study. Okay, so that'll be your limitation section. Okay, so that has its own subheading that you include, and then you have a discussion as to the limitations or weakness of your study. Okay. The next piece is going to be future research, and I think it's not quite in this. I mean, right here. This can be followed by any recommendations of future research, but I want you guys to have a specific heading that says future research. And I want you guys to think, what did you learn from this study, right? What were some of the findings that you're like, oh, this was interesting? And what did it leave you with a question on? Like, I wonder if, in this situation, whatnot. So think that through and think about what would be the next step. So going back to my social media and self-esteem question, if I discovered that the greater length of engagement within with social media led to a decrease in self-esteem, then I would need, maybe one of my questions would be, well, is it for a specific age group? Is it with a specific platform on social media? Is it that when they look through social media in a specific part of the day, right? That's making them feel badly about how things are going. So those would be ideas for future research. Oh my gosh. Go settle. Come here. Okay. So that would be ideas for future research that you could include. Okay. Does that make sense to everyone? What future research would look like? And now I'm wondering if my internet is working. Yes, thank you. Okay. So again, the goal is to think, what would be next? What do I want to know next? So that this, I get a better understanding. Now, it's not suggesting you're doing it, but it is telling the body of research, fellow academicians who are going to be researching this topic, this is where we should be going next. Because I didn't get to answer that with my study, but this is kind of interesting and someone should look into that. Okay. Your last section after future research will be a concluding 2 to 3 sentence. In our research paper, we sought to figure out the impact of social media on self-esteem. We recruited participants from Aquinas University, had them complete a survey, which was based on the Beck Depression Inventory and the amount of social media use they had. Our findings supported our hypothesis that the greater use of social media led to a decrease in self-esteem within our sample. Future research should look into what type of specific platform causes decreases in self-esteem and should focus on having a larger sample size since that was a limitation of our study. Nope, done, okay? So in that concluding section, you are reiterating what was your research problem, who's your participants, how you recruited. So you're kind of taking bits of the methods section. What were your findings, the most important findings? What were some of the limitations of those findings? Again, you just want to pick one, the main one, and then what should be looked at in the future. So your conclusion is literally truncating the entire discussion into just one short paragraph. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, guys. I can't tell if this is like a lecture where you're like, we know all this. Why are we talking about all this? If I'm talking about above people's heads, no clue what's going on today. So hopefully this is all making sense and is helpful. That's the goal of it. So when you're going through, you can look at the overall objective of each section here. Remember to relate the findings to similar studies. You don't need to be doing that as much. Again, you want to look at alternatives for, again, the unexpected findings, limitation, future research. You can look here at some of the problems to avoid. Honestly, this is when you're writing a really long discussion section. I don't think any of you guys will have issues with that. But that is the goal. That this is the discussion section in a nutshell. And I'm gonna go kill him right now because he is driving me crazy. Not really, I just put him back outside and I took away the pumpkin. Okay, so when we meet on Tuesday, we will be discussing each of your discussion sections and focusing on this framework and seeing how we can fit in any questions you may have. How does that works for everyone?
Yeah.
Okay, so remember on Tuesday, we're doing group meetings and Friday is gonna be the last lecture of the semester. And that lecture, let me tell you, we already did quasi experiments. We're going into chapter 14, which is experimenting in the real world. So that's what we'll be doing next week, Friday. And then the week after that is final exam, submitting the final paper, all of the things. Okay. So make sure you are prepared for Tuesday. You need to have a sense as to what is your results section, have that be in front of you so that we can help fill in the gaps for the discussion. I wrote, oh, are you guys still there? That's weird. I wrote the group meeting schedule. I think we did, right? Yes. Let me share this right here so you can see it. The group meeting schedule is written right here for the 20th, which is Tuesday next week. Here's the breakdown of time. So this is when I will see you. So only log on for your specific time. Okay. Any other questions? All right. Then you guys enjoy your weekend and I will see you Tuesday.
Thank you. You too. Bye.